Hello. So I thought I'd just give if you like, a scroll through of an instruction guide that I did on a website called Instructables, which, if you haven't seen it, is a really good community of basically showing people step-by-step guides of how to make stuff. And although on the surface of it, this looks like either a knife tutorial, or indeed, if anyone's familiar with Sugru, which this product does use, it's neither one of those really. I feel, first and foremost, what it is I think a really good primer for design students in how to create a prototype for something where they need to understand the interaction with the user. And admittedly, this is very much a sort of bespoke thing of designing a knife handle which is squishy in two different places, which is what this whole thing is about. The dark blue is more squishy than the light blue, and that gives a different grip and texture. But really, I wanted to sort of show people how I went through the design process, as certainly this is a question I seem to get asked quite a bit by students, is how do you explore things at a granular level? So I hope this is a useful little tutorial, and of course, going into it step by step, visit the links below. So, as I mentioned, the things you will basically need to have a bit of a look out for is this stuff called Sugru, so sugru.com. I'll put a link in below. Disclosure, I used to work there as head of R&D and technology, but this isn't in any way affiliated or been backed by them or an advert or anything like that. This is just something I did in my own free time, and was something because I enjoy cooking. I'm really into sort of knives and that sort of stuff. But I thought it was a good platform to show you how to work through prototypes. So, safe to say, sounds obvious, but doing a little bit of research on what other knife handles are out there was obviously helpful in understanding some of the critical, form features. There's absolutely no reason why, as a design student or young professional, you should have to reinvent the wheel every single time. If someone's got a really good way that you can avoid a whole load of problems, use it. So I certainly did that, and actually the Instructables website is perfect for that. So, but I felt the thing that I noticed is most handles were very static, very fixed, and this was a way that I thought of exploring the potential of, is it a good product to have something which, as you can see here, has two different sort of approaches to how the thing could look. So as you can see here, there it is with a very different setup. So here we go. Lots of writing, as I mentioned, like Joseph for any students or undergraduates looking for a job. That's a great company to work for if you're really into sort of intricate kitchenware that has kind of almost a sort of smile in the mind type pleasure for clever little things that they introduce. So it's fair to say that you need quite a few tools for this, but at the same time, you don't have to go crazy. With the exception of buying Sugru, which is a bit unique unto itself, all the things here I'm really just showing for clarity, but I'd expect most people can get their hands on some craft knives and some little files. I would say that this has been a really nice little addition to my tools, which is a swivel vise or clamp that has a ball socket, so you can move it around. And especially when you're working on the non-sharp part of the blade, it's great to have something that's clamping the dangerous end. So, we're obviously working with a knife here, so please be very, very careful if you do intend to have a go at this yourself. Other little things you might not have noticed are parallel pliers, and they're just kind of useful for doing things where you want to crush something in a very uniform, parallel way, as opposed to pliers, which work more like scissors. So you've got that motion as opposed to that motion. So again, try and introduce a few little cool tools, but you can get by with the basics. Another nice little thing I often do is I get tongue depressors, which are like giant lollipop sticks from the dentist or dentist supplies, and get emery paper or sandpaper and stick it to it. And those are really, really useful for forming shapes, and it means you can, of course, cut them with scalpels into little tiny shapes just to work on something specific. So, little bit of tutorial on what's going on with the knife. The things I'll be referring to, the bolster is the chunky bit at the end, and this is the tang, which is the metal bit that goes through it. And essentially that's one of those things that varies from knife to knife. Some of them just have little tiny bits that go in, but in this case it was much easier to have a full tang knife. So Oh yeah, and shout out to very kindly, the blade was supplied by Tog Knives, so do check those out. I'll put a link in below as well. But it was really just me asking, have you got any spares that you don't need that I could possibly have a go at prototyping? But I wouldn't say that I was paid or I'm particularly endorsing in a heavy-handed way. But I do think they were very kind for giving me a little knife there to work with. So there we go. And what I ended up doing was covering up the sharp part of the knife, and that allowed me to work on mapping out the tang in this basically blue foam. You could use anything, you could use foam core, you could use cardboard, but this was a really nice way for me to end up sort of getting some detail. You could use even clay for this if you wanted to, just to get a feel of what sort of profile would be really good to have as an end result. So I ended up basically using this as a way to think, how do I want to hold the knife and perform different things? And I think it's worth pointing out that what I was doing here wasn't just doing the standard chopping, was also saying, well, actually there's other ways you hold a knife. For example, if you're sort of filleting a fish, or you're doing other things such as cutting the top off a carrot like this. And so I wanted to explore all the different grips. And as a result, that took me to sort of appreciate different ways that I could sort of put the pressure points on the blade, on the handle rather, that would give a different experience when holding it. And I felt, even though some of these might feel a little bit, did you really need to go to that level of detail? I think sometimes just by documenting things as in rough sketches, and you can appreciate these aren't accurate or things of beauty, it just gets you thinking about different ways to interact. And of course, some of them you look back on and you think, this looks a little bit, would your fingers really notice that little difference? Whereas having some distinct points probably is going to be a little bit better. So I think sometimes just being self-critical of those things is a good way to sort of transfer the ideas into something a bit more realistic. So there we go. That was that. And I transferred, as I said, the sort of grip profile onto the tang and made an approximation of what I wanted to achieve. And I think there's a little bit of a license for sort of embellishment in those sorts of things, which is completely reasonable. And again, it's not one of those problems where if you put permanent marker on it, you can wash it off with IPA or any other rubbing alcohol, or acetone if you have it, nail varnish remover. And so I sort of essentially roughed it up with the file, and then took a Dremel and basically laid down the pattern just by scribing into it. I thought one thing that was quite nice to show is that I'm certainly not one of these designers who comes up with great color schemes, but needless to say, there's an app for that, or rather a website called Cooler, which is shown here. And that's really good for if you say, well, I kind of like this color, in my case, this one, what other things go well with it? And even though you can get really into sort of some deep color theory, I just think it's sometimes nice to have a bit of a helping hand in these things. So this sort of helped guide it if you're doing more complex things than just two colors. But a great website. This again was sort of getting into the detail which you needn't, but I was mixing Sugru with something called a softener. And you can actually use blue tack if you want to use something else, or you can just manually press in something which is a sort of powder or filler and experiment with it. But safe to say, I ended up with having something which, if you're not familiar with the hardness scale, the numbers will give you a clue that one was at 75 and one was at 40. And so getting an appreciation of the difference between those two, it gives you a different feel of the knife. So, putting it all together, just showing a few techniques on how to sort of blend Sugru. I think often it sounds obvious when you work in a company how to mix things, but of course Sugru isn't like a paint, it's like a putty. So even just tricks like spiralizing things together before you start to knead them, that really, really helps because it blends the colors quickly. So then I started to apply them to the zones where I wanted the harder Sugru, and then trimming away any of the sort of excess, so you can put it on quite rough and then push it into place. And again, using this clamp really helped a huge amount. And then the soft grip profile, I was using more of the softener and blending it together and then packing it in so that it was nice and well packed into the other Sugru. And safe to say that I did leave it 24 hours before coming back to it, because you want it just to firm up a little bit. Again, refining the handle, I used a combination of sandpapers, as you can see, but then also even things like steel wool is really good for just taking away the surface without chewing up the bolster of the knife, which is the metal bit. And so there we go, and we have the two finished things. And in case you're wondering, these little stripes of copper are a really nice little feature of the TOG knives. So again, the test, I think using it, I really enjoyed using it. It's been one of those things I've had for quite some time now, just chopping in the kitchen. But I sort of love the fact that it was one of those experiments where you can, of course, design as a designer for a huge range of people, but sometimes it's also nice to do something for just one or two people. And so one of the other things that was rather nice, and feel free to link to the other videos in the series, but I ended up working with a chap called Nigel Ackland, who had a prosthetic arm. And because of the experience and the familiarity I developed with all these techniques making the knife handle, it actually helped me modify things to do with his prosthetic hands much, much better. So I always think sometimes setting a project, if you're a student or indeed a professional, where you just go deep into how best to use the material, it sometimes pays dividends later when you actually have, should we say, a more serious or urgent project which you need to really get right. So I hope that's useful. Thanks for watching, and thanks for any comments below. Bye.